Lions and tigers and bears? Seriously? Welcome to another edition of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for almost 38 years. And in that time, I have seen the entire course of research in multiple sclerosis evolve very quickly, and it's continuing to do so. So I'd like to share with you the gleanings from either my own research or from meetings with my doctors. It's all worth discussing. And who better to discuss it with than somebody else who's dealing with multiple sclerosis? Because that's a unique condition. And no one really understands what we're all about unless they too have multiple sclerosis. Well, speaking of which, my friend Mona, and you've met her on this video channel before, she writes a monthly blog for Everyday Health, which is an online newsletter. And because Mona is a really thoughtful person, she's always got some interesting insights. This last month, she had an article about fear of spiders. Always in her life before, she's had the typical fear that we have of spiders, particularly daddy long legs, and it's based on something that happened to her when she was younger. But now things are different. They've been doing some construction on the home. They're making an addition, which I also had a video about, and I'll link that below. They're making an addition on her house, and in the process, of course, they're having to open up this side of the house, which means, especially given the time of year, lots of critters are trying to find their way in, including daddy longlegs spiders, which she's particularly afraid of. And they like the bathroom because there's moisture in there, so she finds herself sharing the bathroom with critters she's not very fond of. Well, she found herself in the tub taking a shower and then realized that she had this daddy longlegs in there with her. And in the old days, before she was disabled, it was a simple matter of stepping out of the tub, getting something to kill the spider with, flushing the spider down the toilet, and getting back in the shower. But it's not that simple anymore. So she had to think about her fear of spiders and really come to terms with it in a way that she hadn't had to do in the past. I particularly like what she says here. Unable to escape, I adapted my thinking. And she says, would I have had the same level of understanding if I wasn't living with MS and compromised mobility? If she still had the luxury of being afraid of spiders, would she just not even really think about it? And she says, normally, I would have just walked out of the bathroom, which I am unable to do, or flushed the spider down the toilet without hesitation, something which I cannot do, given the mobility involved. Tackling a phobia like this means more to me than anyone else, I am sure. And she's had to learn not to panic when she sees daddy long-legged spiders. And in reality, the more you think about it, the more you realize it's not worth panicking about. But what else might be? And that's what we'll look at today. I really do like her article. I'm going to link it for you. But it got me thinking, are we still afraid of the things that we were afraid of when we were younger or before we became particularly disabled? How have our fears changed, and what are the kinds of things people with chronic illness do fear? So we're going to be looking at all of that in the course of this video. But I will say one thing, that like Mona, I've realized that the things that I used to be afraid of, I just don't have the luxury of being afraid of them anymore. Do I really have the luxury of being afraid of spiders? Not really. I know that, and I've said this before, I'm not good at killing them because I always miss. I go to swat them, and somehow my eyesight just, it doesn't give me accurate information about where I should be aiming. So I guess my tennis career is over too. Oh well. But other things that I was afraid of in the past, I'm not as afraid of now. And it's not that I'm a particularly brave person. It's just that there are better things to be afraid of. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at what I've uncovered for us, and we can discuss that a little bit. I'd love to know if any of the fears that I'm going to be talking about are fears that you have had to come to terms with. So let's go ahead and take a look. The article I wanted to look at with you today is by a man named Andrew Pulrang, who writes for Forbes magazine. He writes a column on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the particular one that I wanted to look at with you is Understanding Fear in the Disability Community. It's not specific to multiple sclerosis, but I think it doesn't really matter. I think it's going to be relevant regardless. Here's how he describes himself. I am a freelance writer with lifelong disabilities and 22 years experience as a service provider and executive in nonprofit disability services and advocacy. I write about disability, practices, policy, politics, and culture. I also coordinate CryptoVote, a Twitter-based discussion of disability issues and electoral politics. I have a Bachelor of Arts in History from Dartmouth College and a Master's of Rhetoric and Communication Studies from the University of Virginia. UVA, by the way, is one of my alma maters, so that it might even be possible that he and I were on campus at the same time, but I kind of don't think so. But anyway, you can certainly tell that he has the credentials to be speaking on this topic. And by way of introduction, here's some of what he has to say. The fears involved here are different from incidental worries about everyday matters or the mild background anxieties everyone has about the future. On top of these, disabled people can face unique disability-rooted fears about existential threats. In this context, existential threat means a threat to a people's existence or survival. That is, threats to disabled people's very existence, literally their lives, or more figuratively, their whole way of living. It's an interesting concept, by the way, this idea of existential threats. So when we compare that to spiders, for example, by and large, spiders are not existential threats. So we will be looking at things that possibly could be considered existential threats. And as he says, this may mean a disabled person's fear of dying or of some catastrophic life change. In many ways, the fear of some catastrophic life change is existential. It's a fear of losing life as you know it. And then he starts giving us examples of these existential fears. The first one he talks about is losing autonomy. And here's what he says. This fear is not just about losing the ability to do things for yourself, but loss of control over both the details and direction of your everyday life. It's one of the core fears of disability itself, especially for people who aren't disabled themselves. It's one of the biggest reasons non-disabled people fear becoming disabled. With the right support services and technologies, people who are already quite significantly disabled can still be fully independent, but that means they can lose independence too, even if their disabilities don't change, from occurrences and decisions that are out of their hands and not even related to their actual disabilities. For example, a quadriplegic who lives independently may fear a day when they can't find or pay for home care, or their wheelchair breaks down and can't be repaired or replaced in a timely fashion. These fears are existential because they are about the very foundations of disabled people's everyday lives and independence. And you know, I hear a lot of folks talk who aren't disabled, but they do fear, especially as they see their parents and other relatives, other friends, needing to go into first assisted living and then into nursing homes or hospice care, being in what my husband calls the system. And you do give up an awful lot of control and any kind of certainty about the future. Here's another big one: not being listened to or taken seriously. And he says one of the most significant types of ableism is the tendency to believe that disabled people can't be relied upon to understand their own situations or relate accurate, rational accounts of what is happening to them. Put another way, disabled people are sometimes regarded as unreliable narrators of their own lives. This may seem like something far less than an existential fear, a loss of respect maybe, but not life-changing or threatening. But people with disabilities constantly struggle for basic adult credibility, and when it's lost, other pieces of their lives can start to collapse. You know, I totally understand this because even in being in the workforce, and this is, of course, by comparison, pretty minor, but being in the workforce, you feel all the time like it's very important to be listened to and to be taken seriously. And especially as you get into positions where your ability to persuade people might make the difference for the future of your organization. And by comparison to what Andrew is talking about, that's not really all that important. But as I'm reading this paragraph, actually, I have to say I'm getting kind of angry just at the idea that other people would say that just because you're disabled, you're an unreliable narrator of your own life. I don't know if your hackles went up when I was reading that, but mine sure did. And he goes on to say here, one of the most damaging ways this plays out is in healthcare, where people with certain disabilities and chronic conditions are much too frequently taken less seriously or simply not believed. This can lead to inappropriate treatment and worse medical outcomes. It's important to note, too, that this kind of erosion of credibility is multiplied and layered for people with disabilities who are also from other marginalized communities, such as people of color, women, and LGBTQ+. Even disabled people who seem to be respected and treated well at present can harbor a deeper fear of someday being ignored and dismissed in ways that fundamentally undermine their practical independence and internal human integrity. You know, when I even sense that that's happening to me, I don't even know if it has anything to do with my being disabled or not. But there are people who just tend to give off that vibe that they're not taking you seriously. And I try to nip that one in the bud as soon as I notice it, because I realize that that can become just an assumption that people will make, that they can ignore your opinion or ignore what you say is reality. And that's just not a path that I want to go very far down on at all. And here's another one: poverty. People with disabilities are already more likely to live in poverty or close to it. Over the last several years, disabled people have had 11 to 12% higher rates of poverty than non-disabled people. And while poverty rates in general go up and down with the economy, the gap stays remarkably wide even in the best of times. Also, many of those disabled people who aren't poor now are always just one or two misfortunes or wrong moves away from it. And being poor doesn't just threaten disabled people's lives and safety, it cuts off most of the usual avenues for improvement and drastically degrades their everyday quality of life. For instance, a disabled person who has a job may lose it at any time. This can happen due to ordinary economic conditions, of course, but also for more specific reasons like health changes, outright disability, discrimination, or lack of workplace accommodations. At the same time, many disabled people who do work fear that by earning and saving too much, they will lose some or all of the medical and financial benefits so many still need in order to bolster their health and financial stability. And then he says that poverty is life-threatening both in the literal sense and in its tendency to destroy a disabled person's carefully built sense of stability and basic comfort. All of what he's saying here, I've actually had these thoughts go through my mind, although I don't tend to dwell on them. but especially the part about if I were to earn too much from certain sources, that certain other sources of income for me would be cut off or reduced. And while I don't know how drastically horrible that would be for me, I really don't care to find out. So poverty feels like a real loss of control because a lot of our options for what we're going to do to take care of our disability will be severely curtailed if we don't have the financial resources to deal with them. And then there's pain and suffering as another fear, another existential fear that people with disabilities have. He says this is in some ways the most abstract of the fears, but also the most concrete. It's the fear not of occasional pain and sickness, even when it's especially bad, but of pain and sickness that just goes on and may never end. There's also a well-justified fear of chronic conditions that are beyond either the medical profession or society's capacity or willingness to resolve them or make them livable. I'm kind of thinking MS might fall into these categories. Don't you agree? Not all disabilities, he says, involve chronic debilitating pain or sickness, but some do, and the tools to deal with them are often not as straightforward, available, or even allowed as purely practical accommodations like ramps for wheelchair users, audiobooks for the blind, or sign language interpreting for deaf people. Depending on your set of symptoms and the stage of life you're in, MS can be painful or not. Be everything from numbness, which can have its own kind of pain along with it, or trigeminal neuralgia, which is about the worst pain I've ever experienced in my life. And everything in between, the MS hug or various kinds of neuropathies can be painful. I have a friend who went through a phase where his whole lower legs felt like there were flames, basically, like they were on fire. It was beyond pins and needles. It was very uncomfortable, if not painful, and he had to really learn to live with it because there was nothing that really seemed to be able to be done. Andrew goes on to say this kind of fear is intensified by all too common misunderstanding, outright disbelief, and lack of cooperation from the medical professionals and legal authorities, who can, for various reasons, deny treatment and in recent years criminalize pain relief. Unfortunately, this fear is one of the reasons why at least some disabled and chronically ill people seek the right to end their own lives. Lack of adequate support and understanding prompts some disabled people to weigh and actually choose between different existential fears, fighting one type of fear by giving in to another. It's an unacceptable but not sadly recurring trade-off. Well, I'll just say right here, I just pray that nobody who has a chronic illness, MS or any other kind, it finds themselves in that kind of a situation where they're weighing two unacceptable choices and having to pick one. I realize that in reality, that is true for many people. It really is hard to hear that and to think about it. And I pray that you're not in that situation yourself. If you are, don't give up trying to find a solution, because there may be one where you least expect to find it. And even if there isn't, your life is valuable, whether it's the life that you thought you were going to have or not, whether it's a comfortable life or not, your life is valuable, and you will be missed if you are not here with the people who love you. Okay, and then the last one that he talks about is preventable death. He says, catching, suffering, and dying from COVID-19 continues to be one of the most fundamentally existential fears faced by people with disabilities in the last 50 years. It's not just the medical fear of catching COVID or of having a worse outcome with it because of disability or chronic illness. It's the clear sense that from the beginning, medical and government authorities simply haven't cared enough to protect medically vulnerable people, and in fact, may deep down believe that there's something natural happening if more elderly, disabled, and chronically ill people die. Oh, yes, now that he mentions it, I certainly found myself thinking something very similar. And that's not like me because I don't tend to be very cynical. But there was something about the 2-year-long pandemic thing and all of the different things that we were told that after a while I almost felt I would have been foolish not to at least consider that. As he says, early in the pandemic, at least one lawmaker explicitly suggested that some vulnerable people should be content to die if it means fewer disruptions to the economy and other people's personal freedom. I have not clicked on that link to find out who that one lawmaker is, because I kind of don't want to know. They're entitled to their opinion, but I don't really feel like I want to know who it is. Now most of the American public, according to Andrew, even progressives and the Centers for Disease Control, which high-risk communities once looked to for a more humane approach to battling COVID, appear to want to downplay the pandemic while doing little more than voice vague concern for what it means to high-risk people. Fear of COVID itself is bad enough. Fear of being deliberately abandoned to COVID is what feels existential to disabled and chronically ill people. He continues, it's not just COVID, of course. Many people with disabilities and chronic illnesses fear death or disaster from unexpected sources or from threats they know all too well, but few others recognize. These fears can at times be exaggerated. They can also be distorted or misread or unnecessarily debilitating. But none of these fears are irrational for people with disabilities. It's also important for non-disabled people in particular to understand that most disabled people don't spend all day every day in a state of terror. I will definitely go along with that. Most of the time, he says, these are background fears. They are profound in their implications, but only impact our general outlook in certain situations. On the other hand, severe specific threats like COVID-19 are much more than anxieties for people with disabilities, especially when fewer of their fellow citizens take the threat seriously. And then in conclusion, he says, all of us need to acknowledge, understand, and believe in the validity of disabled people's existential fears. The point isn't to feel sorry for them or persuade disabled people not to be afraid, but to help address the situations and forces that produce their fears. Andrew's purpose here is to advocate, not to provide solutions. So he doesn't really give us a lot of answers about what we're supposed to do. One thing that I'll say about this is it's so important to have a good relationship with your medical team, particularly your neurologist, but your GP as well, and others, if you have other folks on your team, that they have a positive outlook and that they treat you with respect and that they understand that your life is valuable and that it wouldn't just be natural or convenient for you to perish either from your illness or from any other illness. It's never natural for people to die. Death is always a tragedy. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, life is valuable no matter how different it is from the life you thought you were going to be leading. You are still a valuable person. Well, I'm sorry if this topic ended up being a little more morbid than you were probably hoping it would be. But I do think it's important for us to think through a little bit what kinds of fears we have in our lives and which of those fears is what Andrew Pulrang calls existential fears. In other words, fears that go right to the heart of our continued existence versus the kinds of, maybe or even, I guess I'm going to call them irrational fears, like fears of spiders or fear of the dark, in and of itself, of course. We with multiple sclerosis fear the dark for reasons having more to do with our propensity for hurting ourselves in the dark. But the dark in and of itself, or, oh, I don't know, name any common fear, how many of those fears are really life-threatening versus uncomfortable? And maybe that's the best way to look at it. For the ones that are just a little uncomfortable, I'd suggest taking a deeper look at that, like Mona has done, and consider, can you adapt? Since you really can't react perhaps the way you used to be able to do, you can't address the concern about the certain fear. You can't kill the spider. You're not as able to do certain things maybe, but maybe you can change your attitude. And I think that's really important. As far as existential fears, I'm not going to trivialize those. They're all very important. But perhaps some more than others really got to you, or you may be related to a little bit more. I know for me, one of the big ones is not being taken seriously, not being listened to, not being considered a reliable narrator of my own ailments. And that's particularly hard with an illness like multiple sclerosis, where so many of the problems we're having are not visible to other people. There's so much more going on inside that we can have a hard time describing in any kind of way where people will understand what it is. I guess what I'm saying is that, and I think I've said this throughout, you are a valuable person. And your illness did not change that. It didn't make you any less. So if the medical community or society or anyone tries to make you feel like it would be more convenient or you'd be better off if you just weren't even here, that's baloney. So don't even listen to that. You're valuable. I don't even know you, and I know you're valuable. But you might want to think through some of these less irrational fears, like poverty or not being listened to or pain, and think about perhaps as much ahead of time as you can. How will you deal with that? What are your options? What are the resources that might be available to you? Some of which perhaps you aren't currently taking advantage of, but you could. Being prepared is always important no matter where you are in life. But I think for those of us who have chronic illness, we really do need to be thinking about how to take care of ourselves, how to have a good life, regardless of what our illness tries to take from us. So hang in there. And in the meantime, take really, really good care of yourself until you see me again, until I see you again in my next video.